Hi, welcome to story time. Now I know that this year does not look normal, right? This is not story time. You guys are probably not at school right now, but at your homes. But we are going to make the best of it. And just because it's a little bit different does not mean that we are going to miss out on some amazing stories this year, right? So this year, we are going to be reading a story called The Sisters Grimm, the Fairy Tale Detectives. Now, there's a little bit of a backstory of this story that you guys need to know. Now, you guys know all of the stories like the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Cinderella with Prince Charming, Peter Pan, The Little Mermaid, all of these different things. As I'm saying it, you're probably thinking of Disney, right? All of those classics. Well, Disney actually didn't create all of these. The people who did were called the Brothers Grimm. Now, their last name was Grimm, and they were brothers. They actually created all of these different fairy tales, and they're the ones who created these stories. So that's something to keep in mind as we read this, because this is called the Sisters Grimm. So we'll have to find out why it's called that, but you can tell that we're talking about, the Grimms, who they are and what their legacy is with the storytelling, right? So just keep that in mind as we go through the book, where those classic fairy tale stories will be coming into play, okay? So let's get started. This is called The Fairy Tale Detectives by Michael Buckley. This is the first book in a series of, I want to say there is 4, but I could be wrong. Book 1, The Fairy Tale Detectives. The Denise forest branches scratched at their faces and arms, but Sabrina and Daphne couldn't stop running, though they had long since passed the point of exhaustion. Fear was fueling each step now. Another thunderous bellow rang in the distance, followed by the terrible sounds of falling trees and shrieking animals. "We have to find a way to stop it," Daphne cried between gasps. Sabrina knew her little sister was right, but how? They were 2 children versus a vicious monster. "I'll think of something," Sabrina, dragging her sister behind an enormous oak tree for a much-needed rest. Sabrina squeezed her sister's hand to reassure her while she forced oxygen into her own burning lungs. Her words were empty. She didn't have a plan. The only thing going on in her head was the thumping of blood roaring through her eardrums. But it made no difference. It had found them splintering wood and damp soil rained from the sky as the tree they stood next to was violently uprooted. The 2 girls looked up into the horrible face above them and felt hot breath blow through their hair. What happened to our lives? Sabrina wondered. When did their world become unrecognizable? And what had happened to her, the 11-year-old girl who only 2 days ago had been just an orphan on a train? Okay, now we know what an orphan is, right? That means that she does not have a mom or a dad. So that was like the prelude. So it kind of shows what's going to happen, a little taste of the book, right? Now we get in chapter 1, 2 days ago. "I'm going to die of boredom here," Sabrina Grimm thought as she looked out in the train window at Ferryport Landing, New York. The little town in the distance seemed to be mostly hills and trees next to the cold, gray Hudson River. A few 2- and 3-story brownstone buildings huddled around what appeared to be the town's only street. Beyond it were endless acres of evergreen forest. Sabrina could see no movie theaters, malls, or museums, and felt using the word town to describe Ferryport Landing was a bit of a stretch. Worse than the town was the weather. It was raining, and rain always made Sabrina melancholy. Do you know what melancholy is? It's kind of like, think of someone who's kind of like tired, a little bit like dragging around, right? Not like, it's like the opposite of being excited or being outgoing, right? She tucked her long blonde hair behind her ear and turned her head away from the window, promising herself that she would be strong and not let her sister see her cry. She had to be the strong one. After all, she was almost 12 years old. Not that Daphne would have noticed her tears. Sabrina's 7-year-old sister had had her face pressed against the window throughout the 2-hour trip. Daphne had marveled at each ugly little spot on the map they rolled through, taking a break from the view only to ask the occasional question about their destination. "Do they have bagels in Fairyport Landing, Miss Smirt?" Daphne now asked the woman sitting across from them. Mrs. Minerva Smirt was the girls' caseworker. She was a pinched-lipped, humorless woman in her late 50s. Now, a caseworker is someone who is in charge if something happens to your parents and you have to be taken to someone else, or like if you're an orphan, they're the ones who are in charge of making sure that you get to that place. She had had her hooked nose buried in a book for the entire train ride. Sabrina knew she was reading only so she wouldn't have to talk to them. Miss Smirt looked up at Daphne with an annoyed scowl and sighed as if the question was more than she could bear. "Of course they have bagels. They have bagels everywhere," snapped Miss Smirt. "Not on the moon," Daphne replied matter-of-factly as she returned her gaze to the window. Now, it's a scowl. A scowl's kind of like that look, like that bad look, right? Miss Smirt snarled when she caused Sabrina to snicker. Watching Daphne drive Miss Smirt crazy was one of Sabrina's favorite pastimes. Smirt had made a mistake when she chose a career working with children. Sabrina thought, especially since she didn't seem to like them. Miss Smirt complained whenever she had to touch their sticky hands or wipe their runny noses, and reading bedtime stories was completely out of the question. She seemed to especially dislike the Grimm sisters and had labeled them rude, uncooperative, and a couple of know-it-alls. So Sabrina was sure it was Miss Smirt's personal mission to get the girls out of the orphanage and into the foster home. So far, she had failed miserably. She'd sent them to live with people who were usually mean and occasionally crazy, and who had used them as maids, house sitters, or just plain ignored them. But this time, she had gone too far. This time, Miss Smirt was sending them to live with a dead woman. Does that mean? But first off, what a foster home is, in case you don't know, it's like you have an orphanage where all of the children who don't have moms and dads live, right? But a foster home is when you go to live with people and they don't have a bunch of children. They usually just have one or two, maybe one and then maybe a sibling or something, right? That's what a foster home is. "I hope you don't bother your grandmother with all of these ridiculous questions," Mrs. Smirt said curtly, which was how she said most things to Sabrina and Daphne. "She is old and cannot handle a lot of trouble." "She's dead. I've already told you 1,000,000 times. Our grandmother is dead," said Sabrina. "We did a background check, Sally," Miss Smirt replied. "She is who she says she is." "My name is Sabrina," sighed Sabrina. "Whatever. The orphanage would not release you into just anyone's custody," said Miss Smirt. "Oh, really? How about Mrs. Longden, who swore her toilet was haunted?" said Sabrina. "Everyone has their quirks." That means everyone has those little things that can make them kind of weird. "Or Mr. Dennison, who made us sleep in his truck," Daphne chimed in. "Some people love the great outdoors." "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson handcuffed us to a radiator," Sabrina cried. "Dwell on the negative if you choose," said Mrs. Smirt, "but you should be grateful. There is not much of a demand for rude little girls. Imagine how embarrassed I was when I heard what you said to the Keatons. They locked us in their house for 2 weeks so they could go on a cruise to Bora Bora," Sabrina said. "It was the Bahamas," Daphne said. "It was Bermuda, and at least they brought you back some nice t-shirts from their trip," said Mrs. Smirt. "Anyway, it is all water under the bridge now. We found a real relative who is actually eager to take you into her home. But to be honest, girls, even if she was an imposter, I would hand you over to her. We have run out of families who want you." With that, Mrs. Smirt put her nose back into the book. Sabrina looked up at the title. It was How to Get the Love That You Want. "What's an imposter?" Daphne asked, not bothering to turn her head away from the view through the window. "It means someone who's pretending to be someone she's not," Sabrina said as she watched the rain outside. It had been raining the day her parents disappeared. That was over 1.5 years ago, but it still made her heart ache. She remembered rushing home that afternoon with a report card safely tucked inside her raincoat, excited about her A's in math and English and her B in science, and a little disappointed by her C- in gym. She had proudly taped it to the refrigerator for everyone to see. It had seemed odd that her parents weren't home from work, but Sabrina didn't worry until Daphne's kindergarten teacher called to find out why no one had picked up the little girl. That night, the girls slept in their parents' bed, waiting for them to come home as thunder and lightning crashed in the sky around their apartment. When the social worker came 3 days later to take them away, it was still raining, and Sabrina's report card was still hanging on the refrigerator, awaiting its praise. For all Sabrina knew, it was still there. The police had started an investigation. They interviewed neighbors and coworkers. They dusted her fingerprints and filed reports, but they found nothing. Henry and Veronica Grimm had simply vanished into thin air. Months later, the police found their abandoned car. The only clue was a blood-red handprint on the dashboard. The police assured the girls that the print was not blood, only paint, but they still had no leads. Their investigation had come to a dead end. Meanwhile, the orphanage where the girls had been taken began an investigation of its own, searching for the next of kin, but came up as empty as the police. That means, kin is family. No aunts, uncles, grandparents, brothers, sisters, or even distant twice-removed cousins existed. The girls' parents had always told them that they were all the family they would ever need. So naturally, the girls were shocked when a woman claiming to be Grandma Grimm applied for custody. Now the train pulled into the station, and Daphne turned away from the window, cupped her hand over Sabrina's ear, and whispered, "Do you think she could really be our grandmother? Dad said she died before we were born." "Not a chance," Sabrina said as the train came to a stop. "Don't worry, we'll be gone before the crazy old bat knows what happened." Passengers got up from their seats and took their bags down from the luggage racks above. They tossed half-read newspapers into the coffee-stained floor and headed for the door. A conductor announced that Ferryport Landing was the last stop. "Ladies, let's go," Miss Smirt ordered, causing Sabrina's stomach to flip-flop. She didn't want to meet the imposter posing as her grandmother, but Miss Smirt wasn't one to argue with. The old crone had a reputation as a pincher, and she had left more than a few nasty purple bruises on back-talking orphans. Sabrina stood up on her seat, dragged their 2 tiny suitcases down from the storage racks above, and followed Miss Smirt and Daphne off the train. The late November rain was bitingly cold. Daphne began to shiver, so Sabrina wrapped her arm around her sister's shoulders and held her tightly as they stood with Miss Smirt on the crowded platform. "When you meet her, you had better be polite or there is going to be trouble," Miss Smirt said. "No sass, no back talk. Stand up straight and act like young ladies for once. So help me out, Miss Smirt." A voice interrupted the caseworker's threat. The girls looked up to find a chubby old woman standing in front of them. She was dressed in an ankle-length navy blue dress with a white knitted shawl around her shoulders. Her long gray hair was streaked with red, hinting at its original color, and she wore it tightly tucked under a matching navy blue hat with an oblique of a big fuzzy sunflower in the middle. Her face was a collection of wrinkles, sagging skin. Nevertheless, there was something youthful about it. Perhaps it was the old woman's red cheeks and clear green eyes. Next to her stood the skinniest man Sabrina had ever seen. He had a full head of untamed platinum hair and enormous watery eyes buried beneath eyebrows that were in desperate need of a trim. He wore a dark pinstriped suit that was several sizes too big and held a wide umbrella in one hand and his hat in the other. Miss Smirt gave the girls a hard pinch on the shoulder, which acted as a warning to behave, and Sabrina suspected a last opportunity to inflict some pain. "Yes, Mrs. Grimm, it is us," Miss Smirt said, forcing her usual frown into a smile. "Sabrina, Daphne," the woman cried with a hint of German accent. "Oh, you are both so beautiful. What darlings! I'm your grandmother Grimm." She wrapped her chubby arms around the girls and hugged them tightly. The girls squirmed to escape, but the old woman was a little over-affectionate octopus, hugging them and kissing them on their heads and shoulders. Affectionate is like if you're hugging someone, You're just showing them affection, showing them love, right? Through physical touch. Mrs. Grimm, it's so nice to meet you, Miss Smirt interrupted. Mrs. Grimm raised herself up to her full height, which wasn't very high, and cocked her eyebrow at the caseworker. Sabrina could have sworn she saw the old woman smirk. It's nice to meet you, too, said Mrs. Grimm. I am just so thrilled to have helped you and the girls reunite. Oh, I'm sure you are, said the old woman, turning her back on the caseworker and giving the girls a wink. She placed a hand on each girl's shoulder and turned them towards her companion. Girls, this is Mr. Canis. He helps me take care of our house and other matters. He lives with us too, and he'll be helping me look after you, she said. Daphne and Sabrina stared up into the old man's gaunt face. He was so skinny and frail looking that it seemed as though the umbrella he was holding would collapse on him at any moment. He nodded at the girls, then handed Mrs. Grimm the umbrella, picked up the suitcases, and walked down the platform towards the parking lot. Here is a picture. See? So we have, there's the man, there's Grandma Grimm, there's Daphne, Sabrina, and Miss Smirt. Well, girls, this is goodbye, said Miss Smirt as her eyes darted to the open train door. She stepped forward and limply hugged Daphne, whispering something in her ear that made the little girl cringe. Then she hooked Sabrina in her uncomfortable embrace. Let's make this the last time we see each other, the caseworker snarled in Sabrina's ear. Good luck, Mrs. Grimm, Miss Smirt said as she released Sabrina and reached out to shake the hand of the old woman, who looked as if the caseworker were trying to give her something smelly and dead. Miss Smirt, sensing disapproval, hemmed and hawed for a moment and quickly reboarded the train without looking back. The door shut and the train pulled away, back to New York City. As happy as Sabrina was to be rid of Miss Smirt, she realized that their caseworker had left them in the care of a complete stranger. Miss Grimm's barrage of kisses continued all the way down the platform to the parking lot, where Mr. Canis was waiting for them beside the oldest car Sabrina had ever seen. So barrage, like, dingy and covered in rust, it squealed and protested when Mr. Canis opened the back door and the girls crawled inside. Is this safe? Sabrina asked as Mr. Canis and the old woman settled into their seats. It got us here, the old woman laughed. I suppose it will get us back. The car sputtered, backfired, and then roared to life, belching a black fog out of its tailpipe. The engine was an orchestra of gears, grinding so loudly that Sabrina thought she might go deaf. Daphne had already plugged her fingers into her ears. Mrs. Grimm turned to the girls and shouted, Put on your seat belts! What? Sabrina shouted back. What? The old woman asked. I can't hear you. More than 6, the old woman replied. 6 what? Sabrina screamed. Probably, the old woman laughed, turning back around. Sabrina sighed. Daphne took her fingers out of her ears just long enough to hold up the torn straps of her seatbelt. Sabrina rolled her eyes and then looked for hers. She reached down into the ripped-up seats and pulled out a filthy old rope. I told you to put on your seatbelt, Mrs. Grimm said. This? Sabrina shouted, holding up the rope. Yes, here. The old woman leaned into the back seat, tied the torn straps of Daphne's seatbelt to Sabrina's filthy rope so tightly the girl could barely breathe. They're snug as a bug in a rug, the old woman hollered. I love dolphins too, Daphne exclaimed. Not since I hurt my toes, Mrs. Grimm shouted. Sabrina put her face in her hands and groaned. Ugh! They drove through the little town, which consisted of a 2-lane road bordered by a couple of antique stores, a bicycle shop, a police station, the Ferryport Landing post office, a restaurant named Old King Cole's, a toy store, and a beauty parlor. Mr. Canis made a left turn at the town's one and only stoplight, and within seconds they were cruising out of the town proper and into what Mrs. Grimm's called Ferryport Landing's farm country. As far as Sabrina could tell, the only crop this town grew was mud. Mrs. Grimm's house sat far up on a tree-speckled hill, 15 minutes away from the closest neighbor. It was short and squat, much like its owner, and had 2 stories, a wraparound porch, and small windows with bright blue shutters. Fat green shrubs lined the cobblestone path that led to the front door. It all would have looked cozy, but just behind the house loomed the forest, its branches hanging over the little roof, as if the trees were preparing to swallow the house whole. "You live in a dollhouse," Daphne declared, and Mrs. Grimm smiled. But Sabrina wasn't amused. The place was creepy, and she felt as if she was being watched. She squinted to see into the dense trees, but if anyone was spying, they were well hidden. "Why do you live all the way out here?" she asked. New York City was a place where everyone lived on top of each other, and that was exactly how Sabrina liked it. Living out in the middle of nowhere was dangerous and suspicious. "Oh, I like the quiet," said Mrs. Grimm. "It's nice not to hear the honking of horns." "And there's no one to hear the screaming of children up here," Sabrina thought to herself. Mr. Canis unlocked the car's huge, musty trunk and pulled out the 2 tiny suitcases and led everyone to the front door. The old woman followed closely behind, fumbling with her handbag until she fished out what looked like the largest key in the whole world. Hundreds of keys were attached to it, each different from the others. Skeleton keys made from what looked like crystal, ancient brass keys, bright new silver ones in many sizes, and several that didn't look like keys at all. "Wow, that's a lot of keys," Daphne said. "That's a lot of locks," Sabrina added as she eyed the front door. "There must have been a dozen bolts of all shapes and sizes." Mrs. Grimm ignored the comment and flipped through the key ring, inserting one key after another into the locks until she had locked them all. Then she rapped her knuckles on the door 3 times. "We're home!" Daphne looked up at her sisters for an explanation, but Sabrina had none. Instead, she twirled her fingers around her ear and mouthed the words, "Crazy." The little girl giggled. "Let me take your coats, Lieblings," Mrs. Grimm said as they entered the house, and she closed the door behind them, turning the locks one after another. "Liebling?" Daphne asked. "It means sweetheart in German," the old woman said. She opened the coat closet door, and several books tumbled to her feet. Mr. Canis restacked them quickly for her. "Girls, I must warn you, I'm not much of a housekeeper," Mrs. Grimm said. "We'll have dinner in about an hour," she said. Mr. Canis, who picked up the girls' suitcases and headed for the stairs. "Ladies, let me give you the grand tour." She led them into the living room. It was enormous, a much larger room than seemed possible in a cottage so small. Each wall was lined with bookshelves, stuffed with more books than Sabrina had ever seen. Stacks of them also on the floors, the tables, and every surface. A teapot perched precariously on a stack that looked as if it was going to fall at any moment. Books were under the couch cushions. Several giant stacks stood on the front door. Mrs. Grimm led them through another door where a dining room table was littered with books. Things that read the strangest titles: Birds of Oz, the autobiography of an evil queen, and Shoes, Toys, and Cookies, the elfish handcraft tradition. Sabrina picked one up and rolled her eyes when she read the title, 365 Ways to Cook Dragon. The old woman led them from room to room, showing them where she kept the snacks in the white tiled kitchen and how to get the rickety bathroom door closed. Sabrina pretended to be interested, but in reality, she secretly cased the joint. It was a technique that she had picked up after spending a year in the foster care system. In each room, she noted where the windows and doors were eyed locks and paid close attention to creaky floorboards. But it wasn't easy. She kept getting distracted by the odd books and the dozens of old black and white photographs that decorated the walls. Most of them were of a much younger Mrs. Grimm and a stocky bearded man with a wild smile. There were pictures of them hiking in the jungle, standing on an icy glacier, scaling a mountain, and even riding camels in the desert. In some pictures, Mrs. Grimm was carrying a small child in a papoose, while the bearded man stood next to her, proudly beaming at the camera. So, that is the beginning of our book. So far, let's talk about what we have Sabrina and Daphne, right? And these chapters are really long, so I think we're gonna have to do a half a chapter each time. But, so we have Sabrina and Daphne, right? We don't know where their parents are. They're assuming they're dead, but we don't actually know. They never saw bodies, so who knows? So they're going to this old woman named Mrs. Grimm. But we don't know, there's something weird going on, right? Like, who has a cookbook with 365 ways to cook dragon? So that is a little bit suspicious and a little bit of foreshadowing, which we've talked about what foreshadowing is, right? When the author gives you a little bit of hints of what could come later. So they're like important things that you don't realize that are important until later. So that's where we're going to stop this week. And we're just going to have to figure out what Sabrina and Daphne are going to do next week. Okay, bye guys.